dia. Então, ainda não chegámos todos, mas já está uma boa parte, por isso vamos começar para não atrasar. O que eu vos queria dizer é que é uma sorte, é uma grande bênção ter cá o Peter, porque muitos de vocês, se calhar, lembram-se dele do simpósio da Teologia do Corpo, talvez não muitos, mas alguns. E quando ele cá esteve, falou-nos da forma como ele aplica a Teologia do Corpo na prática, na sua prática profissional como psicoterapeuta, especialmente na terapia conjugal. E nós ficámos encantados e com muita vontade de saber mais. E por isso pedimos-lhe para vir aprofundar connosco e explicar mais detalhadamente como é que ele faz isto. Como é que ele integra a antropologia de João Paulo II, a Teologia do Corpo, na forma como faz a abordagem terapêutica. E tem sido fantástico ouvir falar nestes dias e hoje vai ser ainda melhor porque é mesmo dirigido aos psis, não é? E às pessoas que trabalham mais na área do aconselhamento. Portanto, eu agradeço imenso a vossa presença e agradeço imenso a presença dele. Ele prescindiu de muito para poder estar aqui, tem sido muito generoso e portanto, acho que estou mesmo muito grata por tudo o que tem estado a acontecer nestes dias. Não é? Imensas coisas têm acontecido, mas vocês sabem, quando a gente se mete a fazer estas coisas, somos sempre surpreendidos por imensas coisas que se eu começasse aqui um dia, talvez eu escreva, não vale a pena passarmos com tudo. Mas enfim, no meio disto tudo, acho que vem a propósito de começarmos o dia invocando o Espírito Santo que nos vem através de Nossa Senhora, rezando uma Ave Maria, para começar bem o dia, porque isto é organizado pela Pastoral da Família, mas também pela Associação Psicólogos Católicos. Não nos esquecemos disso. Em nome do Pai, do Filho e do Espírito Santo. Amém. Ave Maria, cheia de graça, o Senhor é convosco. Bendita sois vós entre as mulheres, bendito é o fruto do vosso ventre, Jesus. Santa Maria, Mãe de Deus, rogai por nós, pecadores, agora e na hora da nossa morte. Amém. Vinde Espírito Santo, vinde por Maria. Em nome do Pai, do Filho e do Espírito Santo. Amém. It's yours.
It's mine. Am I on? Can you hear me? Good. Well, can we maybe stand a little bit? Yeah. Good. Can you still see me? I feel a little bit like a movie star here on stage. Dear colleagues, brothers and sisters in Christ, it's nice to see you here on this special day for this subject of the integration of faith and psychology. You are the future hope for the mental and spiritual health of Portugal. I'm really so happy to see that people are interested in this integration. There are more and more people all over the place among clients seeking help that want a professional that has a Christian personal basis. So we are trying to respond to that need, and I have for many years been working on how can we integrate our Christian faith with psychotherapeutic approaches that honors the neutrality of the counseling room, while at the same time honors the values and insights of the resources we have in our faith. I have been in this branch now for 40 years, and I would say about 30 of those I've been working with couples. I've been out speaking a lot about it in Denmark and in America. And I've been recommended so many times for the past 20 years to get that book written about it. And now I'm working on it. For many years I thought, well, I would rather do it than talk about it, because I like it's so much fun and so exciting to do the things. And I often felt it was difficult to explain in writing or in a book what I'm doing, because it's so experiential. It's not so intellectual. I want people to experience what we're talking about and then maybe explain what happens. But I see definitely more and more the need to write something about it and try to explain it, and I've been working on that now, and I'm very happy with this opportunity to share some of my ideas with you, and we will have, I hope and expect, a good discussion where all kinds of welcomes will be welcome after the talk. So we have many breaks throughout the day, and we will also have a final session with a lot of questions if you need that. Now I need a little more light here from this side. Can I get that?
Precisa de bocadinho mais luz.
Yeah, down this way. Yeah, good. When I started to practice as a clinical psychologist, I really got the impression in the beginning that the profession was not able to help people with mental pain in a way that I felt was really satisfying and effective. And I kind of still tend to think that way, even though we must say that a discipline of psychology has done a lot of research over the past decades and acquired many insights about the human psyche. Then I still think that the theories and the practical know-how of psychology has been characterized too much by a one-dimensional thinking only in psychological terms. And as my work with clients progressed, then I began to notice that psychological problems seem to be associated with physical, bodily health aspects on one side and spiritual issues on the other. Gradually, it became harder for me to consider psychological problems separate from the other two dimensions. Thus, it's made much sense to me to appreciate the human person as a holistic entity whose existence unfolds in three dimensions at the same time: the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. And I make a diagram like this, a triangle, where we can have a body here, and we have the mind here, and we have spirit here. The body and the mind interact continuously. You can't separate the body from the mind really. What goes on emotionally in your mind affects your body, and what goes on in the body will affect your mental state. And it's all also related to your spiritual dimension. If you have a poor health, so a lot of pain in your body may affect whether you really believe in a loving God or not, and all kinds of thinking can arise around that. So that's a basic concept for me, that all those things interact all the time. But in our culture, everywhere, we tend to separate these three dimensions. In the area of professional human healthcare, we have the physician that takes care of the body, we have the psychologist that takes care of the mind, and we have the church, the priests and the pastors take care of the spiritual. And in my opinion, that separation is not very helpful for us in our attempts to understand and help the suffering person. And as long as we do not understand our subject very well, it limits our ability to help. Am I speaking okay?
Yes.
I mean, not too fast or not too slow? Just let me know. If you want to speed up, then you'll get more. But you also need to follow along. So for many years I worked on developing what I call an integrated model of, to be used in psychological theory and practice. And I call it integrative counseling. I think you call it something else on Portuguese. Yeah. And where I, as I say, I consider the synergistic interplay of mind, body, and spirit in the life of the person. It's, yeah. A person's life is simultaneously lived in all three dimensions all the time. You can't separate them from each other. A little bit in the same way you can't separate two sides of a piece of paper. You can be focusing on one, but the other one is still there all the time. From this work I've done, I've been totally convinced that a psychological problem is easier to understand and treat if we include the physical aspects also. That could be lifestyle issues, physiology, nutrition, sleeping patterns, exercise, and the relevant spiritual issues, the worldview, the sense of meaning in life, ideas of love and forgiveness, life and death, and religious conviction. They affect mental processes too. When a person suffers depression, he may lose interest in eating properly and start filling up on sugars. Either one will deteriorate his physical health and aggravate the depression. When his daily life becomes more miserable, it may have a spiritual consequence, as he may lose trust that there's a meaning in life. Often when a person comes in with a serious depression, I will ask into their diet if I can sort of sense there's some addictive or substance abuse going on, caffeine and sugar. If there's a use of that in excess, it can sometimes almost cause a depression, but it can certainly aggravate it if we have one. Many people don't think about that, but then we get into the whole blood sugar physiology. I won't do that much today, but eating a lot of sugar can affect the blood sugar, and when blood sugar falls slow, you can get all kinds of mood changes from depression, irritation to depression, and even psychotic episodes. But starting to change a person's diet is such an emotional issue that we need to use psychological counseling to approach that, see, so it can work together. And sometimes that's not the right way to begin. Where to begin, going into some bodily thing or some emotional thing or some spiritual thing, is up to us to discern in each case. Working three-dimensionally is like juggling with three balls. You have to, while you have your attention on one of the balls flying, you need to know all the time where you have the other one. So in one way, the best would be if we could work on all three levels at one time, but we can't do that. I haven't found out how to speak about all three different subjects all the time in one language, so I will have to separate it up. And so sometimes I speak about the physical, sometimes the spiritual, but just to give this idea, it's all interconnected. When a psychological case ends up being a hopeless case for the psychologist, it's often because physical and spiritual issues have been ignored. So if we have an issue where a person has excess consumption of sugars and caffeine, for example, we can do very good counseling when they are in our office, and they can feel better when they go home. But if they continue an imbalanced diet, they quickly go down in the hole again. On the other hand, a person can be so spiritually down that there's no meaning in life at all. And in that gloomy state, it's impossible to motivate a person to work on the diet. So there we have to approach the spiritual issue of meaning in life first. The person's lack of trust in God's presence, or no faith at all. Thus, if we're open to consider all three dimensions in one treatment plan, we have a much higher chance of success, the so-called hopeless cases. That's why if somebody asks me, Dr. Peter, what's your specialty? I like to say, hopeless cases. And it's not just a joke, I actually mean it, because I often find them the easiest one to work with. When they come in at the end of their rope, they bring so much energy to the table. They have nothing to lose and they're willing to try anything. And you'll discover that not many cases at all are hopeless if you look at them from a holistic point of view. In my presentation today, I'll not deal much with, or I don't think more than I've done now, with diet and lifestyle, but mainly with the connection between the psychological and the spiritual. As I developed this three-dimensional model, I noticed that the meaning of the concept of illness began to change for him. When we try to understand the client's symptom within the range of a three-dimensional model, then these symptoms seemed less and less to be irrational events that randomly happened to innocent victims who were so unlucky to catch an illness, a mental illness. They seem more and more to be meaningful expressions of the three-dimensional nature of the person that got out of balance and now is trying to restore its original dynamic balance. So mental, emotional disturbances can, from this point of view, be seen as logical consequences of deeper and normal but painful existential challenges. I'll repeat that. Mental emotional disturbances can, from this point of view, be seen as logical consequences of deeper and normal but very painful existential challenges. Behind many depressive states, we often find an existential pain related to traumatic early experiences of rejection that were too painful for the child to face back then and still is in adult age. The depression now becomes a meaningful and actually creative response in the sense that it helps a person avoid feeling a pain that is unbearable, given the personal, social, spiritual resources the person may have at the moment. You follow me now? Seen in this light, it no longer makes sense to look at the symptom of depression as an illness. It's actually an intelligent plan of the person to set up a depression. It's better to function poorly than to break down in total psychotic dysfunction, which could be the consequence of experiencing a pain that goes beyond your limits and make you go crazy. So once we no longer look at the client's symptom as illness, we notice a qualitative change in our understanding of the problem, and the spirit of our approach to our client will change accordingly. We can now much better look at the illness and its symptoms as a language spoken to us from deep layers of the client's being. A language we have to listen to and communicate with, instead of just writing off as something sick. Behind the seemingly meaningless illness, I see an encapsulated state of human suffering. The challenge is not to get rid of the suffering as quickly as possible through medical drugs, for example, which can only numb it and remove it anyway, but to come to terms with this suffering as an occasional, inevitable part of the existential condition of man. Even though this redefinition of the psychological problem does not necessarily remove the symptoms and the behavioral difficulties overnight, our basic attitude towards the afflicted person has changed. We see now the dysfunction as a meaningful defense against an unbearable mental pain that transcends the psychological and psychiatric domain and reaches deeply into the spiritual and existential. Thus, we are also setting the stage for renewing the identity of the afflicted client, who is no longer seen as a sick patient that needs to be cured, but a suffering person that needs to be understood and met with compassion by the professional, who, from an existential point of view, is in the same boat as the client. One of my teachers, a Catholic psychologist and priest, Adrian Van Kahn, wrote a beautiful little book called The Art of Existential Counseling. And in that, he defines, he says, a meeting between a client and a professional is primarily a meeting between two human persons. Secondarily, it's a meeting between a client and a professional. I like that one. In this way, the human dignity of the mentally ill person has been restored, which is tremendously healing for the ill person. Calling a person ill in his mind affects his sense of dignity negatively. Nobody wants to be mentally ill, but to suffer is a lot more acceptable as part of being a human person. Everybody has to deal with that. I've seen both in America where I've lived and in Denmark a lot of attempts in the psychiatric field to make it normal to be mentally ill or okay. You know, so that we should avoid the stigmatizing mentally ill people. A lot of mental illness days, and I don't know what, and, you know, and I don't do that here too. If you have something like that also in Portugal, no. But it's going on up there, and it just never works. There's no way you can make a label of mental illness feel good because of the word illness. But that's because secular culture has no way of coping with suffering. It goes totally against the happy life. That's the ideal. So suffering is sickness. We refer it to the medical domain, and then we dirt it up. And we lose so much and create more misery, by the way. I'll tell you briefly, one of my clients was heavily schizophrenic, had psychotic breaks down in the doctor's office and attacked him violently, and was finally drugged heavily and been in ward care for many years. And he came to me and he walked in sort of stiff like this and stared, you know, and sat down very stiff. It was very clear that he was very much drugged up, and I wondered, what can I do for that man? But he wanted to see me. So we sat down and he looked at me, as you know, with a long look. And I said, what can I do for you? He said, I would like to be in touch with my feelings. He said, I have written a poem. Then he took a poem and read it to me. And it was something like, I cannot laugh, I cannot cry. The moments are dripping slowly down. In Danish it rhymes, it doesn't. Okay. And then I began to ask into his life and his childhood and his experience in school, and I slowly got the picture of a childhood with a little boy with parents who were totally incapable of relating to the emotional life of a little boy. It was just totally cold, distant, rejective, and not physically abusive or anything, but just like ice, you know. And I saw more and more this sad little boy. Then in high school, he had been heavily rejected by a girl he had tried to approach, and then all the symptoms broke out. And as I listened to him, I became so sad when I saw this little boy in him. And finally, I just blurted out, you know, you're not sick, you're just so sad, so sad. And then it hit him like a shock, and he began to jerk in his body. And for a moment I thought, wow, I wonder if I unleashed too much and he was going to attack me. And then he broke down sobbing. Yeah. And he was happy. Afterwards he was just glowing. Oh, I finally felt my emotions. And for a long time he was really calm and even. Just an example. The three-dimensional concept that I refer to is mind, body, spirit, right? Now there are many spiritual belief systems available today. So a decision to make is, of course, what spirituality to refer to, which we use this model. And my choice has been the Roman Catholic version of Christian spirituality. I have arrived at that through 25 years of searching and studies in new religious movements, Eastern traditions, and Western this and that, and to a series of personal revelations of the power and healing potential of the Christian faith, I have come back to the Christian tradition. And it was through Catholic theology that I understood some depths about suffering I haven't seen in other places. I found here an ability to account for human suffering without the loss of the dignity of the suffering soul. So like any other scientist, the professional psychologists need to work and reflect on the basis of a theory about the human person, right? We scientists. A theory that can answer three basic questions of human conditions. Where do we come from? How did we end up in this mess? How do we get out of it again? Some very Christian, a very beautiful evangelical radio show person, Chuck Colson from Breakpoint in the US, I don't know if you know him, no. He said that if there's a spiritual supermarket available today, and if you have to choose something, you should choose whatever best answers these three questions that we all are dealing with. And to me, the Catholic worldview offers some answers that related to me. Good enough to qualify for working hypotheses. So instead of saying, I believe that's the truth, I say, as a scientist, it makes sense to look at that as a working hypothesis. Then we will see if the observations and conclusions from our work in the field will affirm the theory or question it. So far I'll say that my experiences in the field have affirmed that the faith we share is on to a wisdom that not only explains the psychological universe of the human person, but goes beyond it in a way that still makes sense to human reason. What I like about the former Pope Benedict, when he discusses a lot about the connection between faith and reason, and he says it's okay that faith goes beyond reason. It must, because we can't grasp the whole thing with our own rational mind. But faith should never contradict reason. So we got a rational mind, and we absolutely need to use it. And it must work with faith. The two should balance each other, they need each other. He's done a lot of writing on that. As a professional therapist, I cannot and should not preach the blessed wisdom of the gospel, of course. So I have had many reflections about the difference between the preached and the therapist, and how I can avoid mixing them together. In regards to personal belief systems and religious convictions, the counseling room must be neutral. Thus, in regards to the client, my main focus is not on what religion, belief system, or lack of the same the client brings in to the counseling, but to be aware of if the beliefs or values he holds are consistent with those conclusions and decisions he operates from. The premise I base my work on is the understanding that every person has a need of being integrated, which refers to a state where one's worldview and action, they correspond together. When they are not in line with each other, the person carries a split within himself and can cause many psychological difficulties. For example, if a person on the spiritual level believes in an all-forgiving, loving God, but on the psychological level is burdened by chronic guilt feelings, then something is out of sync that we must take a closer look at. There I see it's the task of the therapist to help the client become aware of this inner incoherence conflict and assist him in working through it, so the client can end up in a place where there is a balance between belief, faith, and action. Whether then it's the faith that needs some adjustment or the personal experience, we do not know. But can we make them hang together, the mental health is strengthened. This may be a little abstract, but I'll get into case stories about it. In my work with non-Christians, probably you have many questions about that, I cannot enforce or proclaim the Christian worldview. But I always ask my clients if they have a certain faith in the beginning, and if they want it used in the counseling. Then we'll explore that, what resources are available here, and whether these can be accessed and used in a constructive way to help the client. In using this approach, I think it's imperative that we, as counselors, have a strong faith ourselves, not in order to preach it necessarily, I mean, in this way, as I've shown, but in order to signal that faith is possible. Sometimes a client will ask me, you seem to have peace in some level. You feel at peace. Where does that come from? And then one can open up a little bit, as much as okay. I once had a Christian client when I was working in Minnesota who knew I was Christian and who came into me and said, I would like to counsel with you, but don't you play any Jesus tricks on me. So I said, fair enough, that's a deal. So I avoided very, very keenly any kind of reference or concepts that had a little spiritual taste. And then we ended up with that she had been terribly abused as a child, awfully, and what she would like to learn was to forgive her parents. And there I ended up saying, that I don't think is humanly possible. So if you want to learn that, we need to look for powers beyond our human capacity. But we have this agreement. So either we renegotiate the contract, or I refer you to a pastor in town. You can talk about it there. She thought that was fair enough, and she went to a pastor in town. I would like to give you a little case now. Rick, I call him. He really made an impression on me immediately when he came into the room. He sits down heavily and he's tired looking. It's taken him a long time to decide to see a psychologist, but now he finally does so. It's not typical for him at all. He's a very independent, self-reliant person, very action-oriented, and he's in his late 30s. What is getting to him is a very personal issue that cuts through to the core, way into the naked truth, you can say, about one of our deepest and most frightening existential conditions, called helplessness. He chose a psychologist that he knows is very open to include the dimension of faith in the therapeutic work. He's a Christian, or believer, as it's called, and he's very engaged in his church. And for many Christians, it can be quite embarrassing to seek help from a counselor, because you then somehow admit that the God you believed in and were counting on in daily life obviously no longer can or want to solve the problem for you. His facial expression is very grave. The expression in his eyes holds a combination of dullness, grief, and bitterness. For quite some time now, he's been plagued by frequent nightmares. And I can sense that so far he's tried to cope with his situation by dissociating himself from reality, supported by frequent ironical comments. I already know part of his problem from our first phone conversation, and I know what incredible agony he's in. But this morning of his first personal meeting with me, the inner battle of his soul is laid out in a detailed and profound way that really hits my heart. He's married and he has a little 3-year-old girl who's just nuts about her daddy. He suffers from a terrible illness in his lower back, and he's been through 5 surgeries already. Following the last surgery, there are complications that leave him bedridden for a long time, where he lies helpless, without any hope for the future, and in unbearable physical pain that even heavy dosages pain of killing medicine cannot relieve him from. Now, during this time, his wife leaves him for another man and takes a little girl along. He relates this to me in a monotonous, ironical way, totally void of any emotions. This is the first time he tells his story to another person who is sincerely focused on how he is feeling about all this. As he speaks, he grows more and more gray in his complexion and appears almost petrified. All emotional activity is shut down for many good reasons. I'm trying to put myself in his shoes, to awaken a sincere compassion that can inspire me to say something that can break through to his isolation in the darkness of his soul. All of a sudden it hits me how insane and excruciating and inapproachable his pain is and nothing comes to me. What do you say to a person in that situation? It is as if everything I could say or do what would be inappropriate that would be appropriate in many other contexts would be sort of superficial or cheap here, almost embarrassingly disrespectful in this space I've been thrown into with him. So powerlessness began to grow in me. Left to my own powerlessness, I tried to accept the silence and the nagging, growing feeling of incompetence. All these thoughts, no, I'm getting paid for this and I have to do something. You probably know that. I try to get used to these very unpleasant emotional states and have to remind myself frequently that it's okay to take the time it takes. This is what I teach others. It's like something deeper is going on here that may not be meaningless at all, but I can't pin it down. I reflect on his helplessness in the depths of his physical pain that reminds me of torture. And I'm thinking about his close ones, whom he needs the most in this hour of immense suffering, are betraying him, letting him down at the point in time when he's more vulnerable than ever. And then all of a sudden it dawns on me what it was I couldn't pin down. This theme is now dazzling clear. The experience he finds himself in the middle of has on the experiential level some impressive parallels to the crucifixion of Christ. And what is very interesting is that this is a theme Rick knows all about from his own Christian faith and church activity. However, without him having ever been able to relate it to the concrete situation he now finds himself in. So I want to try and see if I can activate the resources that we can assume are available for him in his own faith. So I say, sort of spontaneously, you are experiencing a crucifixion. I didn't quite know how he would react, but I can see that when this theme is clearly expressed in our dialogue, something happens to him. The words really hit deep. He's suddenly given a new terminology by which he can express his pain and put it into a much wider context. We there bridge the gap between his faith and his situation here and now. He remains totally silent and very thoughtful for quite a while. And all the while, the features in his grave facial expression softens up, as if dark shadow over him drifts away. Life returns into his eyes. I sense some deep relief going on, and then he replies slowly, but with genuine amazement in his voice, "I never thought of it that way." This experience became a turning point in his therapy course. 2 weeks later, he remarks that this reference to the theme of the crucifixion was a tremendous help. Something decisively has happened, something was touched deep inside, especially as he found renewed confidence that it is possible to get through his suffering. He takes things lighter. These changes seem to persevere. 4 weeks later, he tells me that he's begun to feel joy again as something coming from within. And it's a long time since he has felt anything like that, he comments. He's also started reading closely the parts of the Bible that deals with innocent and seemingly meaningless suffering, and found strength in believing that God never lets you down. His face is stronger. The work we've done earlier on his tremendous anger with his wife is carrying fruit. He has not really felt so much anger since, and the disappointment, the bitterness is much reduced. But the grief and the sadness is coming up with more fullness, which is a good sign, because we find more life and warmth in that than in bitterness. He has more dreams at night, but not nightmares. It's very clear that his face has been added a new and deeper dimension following his crisis. That was my introduction about sort of the thoughts behind integrated counseling. The little aperitif. Just a few minutes break, take a little water, and then we'll continue.